topic is the medical management of Parkinson's disease, the medications that we use in Parkinson's. There are several ways that you could learn about the drugs that are used. There are many to speak about. We can talk just about general classes of drugs, just to begin with. That's how I'll do it. They will be familiar to you because you're using them. I'll talk about then the history, because that is the most fun part, is how we know about what's going to happen next is based on what's already happened in the past. So the history is quite fascinating too. And then we'll talk about not just classes of medications, but when to use them. That's the art of being a good physician, knowing the appropriate time and dose and medicine to use at various stages of the illness. And that's actually probably the most useful part of the talk. So in general, there are two kinds of medications used for Parkinson's disease. I always like to say those that work and those that don't. The fact is there are two kinds of medications. Those that are used to relieve symptoms, in other words, to improve your ability to function motorically. So the symptoms that, we call that symptomatic therapy, and really everything we're going to talk about today is really symptomatic therapy, because the other class of drugs would be neuroprotective therapies. And neuroprotective therapies address the underlying disease process and slow the progression of the disease. And there's not much really there. The neuroprotective studies are hard to demonstrate to be effective. And there, I'll talk at the end about a number of neuroprotective studies that turned out to show that there was no effect of these doses of these medications or substances. Because some of the neuroprotective studies have been high-dose vitamin E, for example, or high-dose coenzyme Q10. Those are studies that failed. Selegiline, which was designed as a neuroprotective study. Many of you know of it as Deprenyl. Well, those studies were used 800 patients, followed over 5 years, and they didn't slow progression of the disease. So I'm not going to talk much about neuroprotective studies, but that's really where we're headed. That's really what's most important. Because it's one thing to alleviate symptoms. It would be the equivalent of sewing up a wound, so you don't, to help you feel better, so you don't continue to have pain or infection, etc. So I'll talk about the most important of all of these symptomatic medications. It's the dopamine replacement medications. And the gold standard is levodopa, which isn't ever given alone since 1970. Yet in certain parts of the world, it can be given alone. Levodopa, in combination with carbidopa, is known as Sinemet, and that's the gold standard of therapy. There are variations of that, levodopa, carbidopa. Sometimes instead of carbidopa, benserazide is used with levodopa, and that's called Matopar, and that's available in Europe. And there's other formulations of levodopa, carbidopa that affect how fast it's absorbed and how long it stays in the circulation. It's called sustained release or extended release or controlled release levodopa. And even now they have a levodopa, carbidopa in a formulation that is also slow release called Ritare. There have been a number of slow release preparations of levodopa, carbidopa. So the alternative to levodopa, carbidopa, it would be a dopamine agonist. And there's a series of drugs that have been developed. The first that was developed was called bromocriptine, still available, and that acts directly to stimulate dopamine receptors. The other one that is used was pergolide. It was a very effective dopamine agonist, and unfortunately it was voluntarily withdrawn by Eli Lilly because there were a number of cases of cardiac valve abnormalities, even though it was really a very, very useful dopamine agonist. And then the more recent dopamine agonists have been pramipexole, known as Mirapex, and Requip or ropinirole. And the newest one of them all is called rotigotine. It's another dopamine agonist that is delivered through the skin, and it's known as Nupro patch. And that results in very constant, steady state levels in the blood of the drug because it's continuously released. There's a tremendous advantage to that. So those are the drugs. When do we start using? Well, that's the first class of drugs to relieve symptoms and the most effective. So it's levodopa-based drug, which is the natural precursor, by the way, of dopamine. So when we give levodopa, what we're doing is facilitating the synthesis of more dopamine by your brain, by your own system, So you give levodopa, which is a naturally occurring amino acid, but it's of course concentrated and purified and put into a pill. But amino acids are just found in all proteins. And all proteins are made up of chains of these amino acids. And well, this amino acid, levodopa, which is found in all protein, when given in the range of 100 to 250 milligrams in a tablet, along with carbidopa, gets into the brain, is converted into dopamine by surviving dopamine neurons, and sometimes other cells will convert it into dopamine, but it's taken up that dopamine and stored in dopamine neurons, and that allows the motor function to be restored almost to normal. So that's what levodopa does. It gives the raw material to making more dopamine, and it works beautifully. The problem with levodopa in the very early stages, and I should get a bit into the history of this in a moment, but the problem with levodopa is when it was first given, it was given either intravenously, but and it was very dramatic, but in terms of its benefit, the problem is it caused tremendous nausea and vomiting. And if it was given regularly into the veins, it would cause corrosion of the veins. It's very difficult. It auto-oxidizes levodopa. So it could never be given intravenously, other than once in the early days, in single doses or a few doses. They soon discovered, and by the way, when levodopa was first being studied, they began that it couldn't be given intravenously because of tremendous local problems at the level of the vein, and then nausea and vomiting. They began to feed it as pure levodopa. And the doses were given orally and gradually increased until people could tolerate it. The majority of people could never tolerate levodopa because you have to take maybe 8 grams a day. Think of that, 8 grams a day. Like, let's say 8 tablespoons of levodopa a day. That would make anyone throw up. So, but it was found that the reason that levodopa given orally was causing nausea and vomiting was that levodopa, when it was absorbed from the stomach and intestine into the liver, into the blood, and then the liver, was metabolized into dopamine by liver and also the enzymes that line the gut. There's an enzyme called peripheral decarboxylase that breaks down the levodopa and makes dopamine. So there's circulating dopamine in the blood, and we don't want circulating dopamine in the blood because that'll cause vomiting. The reason it causes vomiting is that at the blood-brain barrier, there's a dopamine receptor that triggers vomiting in the brainstem. That's why anti-dopamine drugs that block dopamine receptors are the essence of anti-nausea drugs. So all that levodopa taken orally, absorbed by the gut, into the blood, and then it passes from the portal circulation to the liver, is metabolized into dopamine that then continues to circulate in the blood, and 2 things happen. You throw up, you feel miserable, and dopamine can't cross the blood-brain barrier. Because a lot of things can't cross the blood-brain barrier. The amino acids, including levodopa, can cross the blood-brain barrier through a special doorway called the levodopa transporter, or the neutral amino acid transporter. It's a special energy-dependent channel that pumps levodopa that's circulating after you've ingested levodopa in the form of cinnamon, and pumps it into the brain. Once levodopa is into the brain, it can be made into dopamine and stored. So there's a whole process. When you take levodopa, carbidopa, there's a lot of steps that are involved. So by adding carbidopa, this was found to inhibit that enzyme in the liver and in the gut that makes dopamine. And it only acts outside the brain. Carbidopa, unlike levodopa, can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So when you take levodopa, carbidopa takes care of the enzymes that are breaking down the levodopa. So it's kind of protective of levodopa. It would be like a blocker for a halfback trying to cross the line, so to speak, those football fans. So carbidopa resembles levodopa, but it's structured so it can't get into the brain, but it will recognize the same enzyme that breaks down levodopa and occupy it. And so that levodopa can cross the brain. So instead of taking grams of levodopa, you can take milligrams of levodopa. So that's why you take 100 milligrams in a 25-100 levodopa tablet, or 250 milligrams instead of grams. Remember, there's 1,000 milligrams in 1 gram, right? And you were taking 8 grams of levodopa in the era before carbidopa. You're taking 8,000 milligrams of levodopa. You can imagine how sick people must have felt, right? So that was the big breakthrough. Now, how did this story come about? Well, what's fascinating is that James Parkinson described this illness in the early 19th century. And I think it wasn't until in the 19th century the neurologists and neuropathologists who studied the brain in patients who had Parkinson's disease while they were alive, they didn't see anything abnormal in the brain. So they considered this disorder, it must be a neurosis. Means the brain structure is normal, but at times there's a block in the ability to move. It's like there's a dissociation between will to move and the mechanism to move. The reason is and you know this, even before levodopa, at times people with Parkinson's disease could get up and walk, especially if they were suddenly stressed. So here's a person that is in a wheelchair, and then someone yells fire, and they could quickly get up and run. So this was noted by the French neurologists in the 19th century. So, well, if they can still operate their machinery, in other words, the muscles of movement, why sometimes can they not initiate it? So there was like a block. So they thought that was a neurosis because they couldn't find anything obvious in the structure of the brain. The reason is that their technology was limited. So, and it wasn't until people began to look a little bit carefully at the chemistry of the brain, and that wasn't until 1950. And I'll tell you why they began to look in 1950. But around 1913, they did look at Parkinson's disease brains and found that there was an abnormality after all. There was really 2 abnormalities that were noted. One was the presence of these pink staining inclusions known as Lewy bodies, and they seem to be associated in brains with Parkinson's disease. Occasionally you could find them in people that didn't have Parkinson's disease. So in 1913 they didn't make that much sense of it. It wasn't until later then, and really in the last 15 years, that we realized that the spread of Lewy bodies correlates with the progression of the disease. And that the Lewy bodies are present for many, many years before you have symptoms. And when the Lewy bodies get to the midbrain, where dopamine neurons reside, those Lewy bodies interfere with the production of dopamine. And with less dopamine, you have the loss of initiation of movement and this automatic execution of movement that you've done since you were an infant. So dopamine was found to be the key issue. So initially they find that there's Lewy bodies and they accumulate in the midbrain. And it wasn't until the 50s that the neurochemical analyses of brain tissue were really possible with a very highly sensitive assay method. How do you measure an invisible chemical? You make visible the invisible using chemical techniques. I'll tell you quickly how it's done, and it's very interesting. So why would anyone even think of looking at dopamine in Parkinson's disease? Right. Well, they didn't think of it right away. It took a long time. But if they hadn't thought of measuring dopamine, we wouldn't have developed the most important drug class for treating the disease, which is dopamine replacement, or levodopa carbidopa, or dopamine agonists that served as synthetic dopamine. So what happened was this, that in 1950, and this was the beginning of a lot of surgical treatments for movement disorders. They were doing, for Parkinson's disease, a lot of thalamotomies in the 50s. And that was the major treatment at that point, was kind of putting electrodes into the globus pallidus and making lesions. Actually, they explored many different parts of the brain for a number of movement disorders because we realized that there were derangements in the deep gray structures of the brain, called the basal ganglia. When they were abnormal, movement was abnormal. So they realized that certain parts of those deep gray structures might be overactive. It was really an accident. And it's serendipitous observation that if a person, how this was found is another cool story. Lesions of certain parts of those deep gray structures would improve symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And so they began to apply those lesions, make artificial strokes. That was, okay, so that was the beginning of neurosurgical treatment of movement disorders. So how that was found is that there was a person who had Parkinson's disease, who also had an aneurysm, and during the procedure for tying off the abnormal blood vessel that had ballooned out, they cut the supply, the blood supply, to the globus pallidus. Inadvertently, they tied off this very small blood vessel that supplies one of the key structures for the control of movement deep in the brain, called the globus pallidus, which is still a target for neurosurgery today. But in the days when this was found, when the person recovered from the surgery, they realized that the symptoms on one side of the body of Parkinson's disease were gone. That the stroke had improved, the artificial tiny stroke that was that was caused by the surgeon treating the aneurysm, had alleviated the symptoms on the opposite side. So that led to a lot of experimental treatments in animals of various lesions, started in the 50s, etc. So that was what was going on about surgery. And there's another thing about surgery. So they were treating in the 50s movement disorders with surgery based on this empirical observation after a person had a stroke, an aneurysm tied off. There was a really interesting parallel process going on in the 50s. There was the development of psychosurgery for schizophrenia. So they were doing prefrontal lobotomies and eventually got very quick and put a nice pick right into here and severed the frontal lobes from the rest of the brain, and so violent schizophrenics no longer were violent. You remember One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know how many of you know that. Many of you are of the generation that remember when they were doing prefrontal lobotomies for aggressive psychiatric patients and made people basically put them in a vegetative state. They were also at that time in the 50s doing surgery to treat opiate dependence. So there's a lot of really aggressive surgical procedures to treat psychiatric disorders, this psychosurgery, which is kind of scary. It's a kind of scary thing. So why did the psychosurgery and the and the treatment of movement disorders with surgery stop until more recently? It's now come back again because now they're doing more refined surgery with electrode stimulation instead of making a hole. So it's come back, but we're going to get into how it came back. What happened simultaneous to the development of surgery for movement disorders and psychiatric conditions in the 1950s was the development of the first major tranquilizer. So that was called thorazine or phenothiazine. And it's like a powerful antihistamine. Thorazine is a drug that's very similar to antihistamines. And you know that antihistamines, you all have taken them at night to help you sleep, or for allergies, are very calming. Imagine a souped up antihistamine. Well, that's what phenothiazine is. And it was found to be a powerful tranquilizer, and antipsychotic agent. So if you gave a paranoid schizophrenic Thorazine, you could completely stop his delusions, illusions, hallucinations, and psychosis. It was quite remarkable. So these people would no longer need to have prefrontal lobotomies. So gradually, the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, were taking the patients away from the surgeons. So surgeons weren't being referred for that kind of for that kind of treatment for their psychosis. But the major tranquilizer, phenothiazine, had a tremendous impact in the amongst psychiatric patients. What happened is this: most of these very advanced psychiatric patients were in state psychiatric wards. With the development of the major tranquilizers, Thorazine in the 50s, those patients could be managed as outpatients. So many of these big state institutions closed their doors, and the use of antipsychotics has flourished to the moment. But what happened is, within a few years of using these antipsychotic drugs, the psychiatrists noticed that these young schizophrenic patients who had been treated and were doing well were developing Parkinsonism. They began to walk with shuffling gait, masked face, drooling, rest tremor, cogwheel rigidity, the classical picture of Parkinson's syndrome in young schizophrenics in the 50s with the use of Thorazine. It's one of the major side effects of all major tranquilizers. Why we don't use major tranquilizers in Parkinson's disease is that these drugs can produce Parkinson's syndrome in people who don't have Parkinson's disease. And if you take away the drug, their Parkinson's syndrome improves. Now, that was no one really understood. Why does a Thorazine cause a Parkinson's syndrome in these young schizophrenics? So a guy who won a Nobel Prize for this started this work in the 1950s, the beginnings of rock and roll. Elvis was not around yet. Well, he was, but he wasn't, really much. It was the Platters and really those the great singing groups were around. What was going on in the lab in the 50s that you probably didn't know about was that Averitt Carlson began to give this Thorazine to animals, and he could reproduce Parkinson's syndrome in animals. This is the first time there's a really good animal model of Parkinson's disease. So he'd give Thorazine to mice or rats, and they'd become rigid as a log, and they could hardly move, and I'd pick up a rat by putting his tail on one finger and his snout on the other, and he would just be rigid as a log. And he began to try to understand, how does this work in the brain? How does this drug cause Parkinsonism in the brain? So he began to look at a number of things, and one of the big advances at that age was the development of a method for measuring these neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitter pharmacology was really booming after we could measure neurochemicals that serve as messengers in communicating nerve impulse information from one set of brain cells to another. So our brains are both electrical and chemical. And the chemical that's released, that's very important in those deep gray structures in the control of movement, is called dopamine. So he began to measure dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and those kinds of neurotransmitters. And to make a long story short, because we have a lot more to cover, he was able to discover, because he studied another drug that did something to dopamine levels, he found that dopamine was affected, and in another model, where if you deplete dopamine with something called Reserpine, which is an ancient drug, comes from India, from a vine called Rarufia serpentina. It was used to lower blood pressure initially, but it caused tremendous depression because Reserpine lowered dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. That also caused a rigid Parkinson model. So in both the Thorazine and the Reserpine models, he had Parkinsonism. In one, he found that dopamine was gone. He depleted it. That was the Reserpine. In the other, he found that dopamine was blocked at the receptor. That Thorazine blocked the dopamine receptor. So anything that interfered with dopamine action caused Parkinson's syndrome. So he said, wow, if dopamine seems to, deficiency or interference of dopamine action causes a Parkinson's syndrome in animals, what's it doing in human brain, right? Remember, we didn't know about dopamine in brain, never been measured in human brain. This is animal studies. It's the 1950s. So he was able to get brain tissue from a colleague that had a brain bank and began to measure dopamine, serotonin, and these neurochemicals in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease. That in life they had Parkinson's disease, the brains were donated. And he found that dopamine was depleted 90% and it was wiped out. And there's a little bit of decrease in norepinephrine as well, and in serotonin. But the key finding, these Parkinson's brains don't have any dopamine. In fact, the cells that make dopamine, that you could visualize with immunochemistry, were also markedly diminished. So those studies in the late 50s, early 60s proved that in Parkinson's disease there is a deficiency of dopamine. We knew that in animal models, if you deplete dopamine and then replace dopamine with levodopa, this was done in animal models, you could replenish dopamine and animals would become normal really quickly. So that led to the first trial of levodopa in humans with Parkinson's disease. And I already told you what happened. Most people couldn't take it because levodopa makes you throw up unless you give it with carbidopa. And you should know, like many of my patients know, that when you add carbidopa to levodopa, it's levodopa without vomiting. And that's what Sinemet means. Sin-emesis is the Latin word for without vomit. So the brand name given to levodopa with carbidopa is called no vomit. Sinemet means no vomit. It's a brand name. It's based on the root sin-emesis. And yet I still have patients who say, I take the Sinemet and I get nauseous. It still has a little bit of nausea. And some people, no matter what you do, even if you start with a quarter tablet, they still have nausea. Sometimes it's helped if you give additional carbidopa, and that will help. So why did we have issues with levodopa? Why didn't we just stay there? Why didn't we cure the disease? We found that Parkinson's disease brains didn't have enough dopamine. We give levodopa, they get better. And in fact, what levodopa is really good for, as you replace dopamine, is to improve slowness of movement and rigidity, and to some degree tremor. But we learned that it won't help the falling part. It won't help the gait. Once you start having episodes of freezing, just quick, or difficulty initiating the movement, or loss of balance, oftentimes levodopa, dopamine replacement was not the answer. And that's the place where we are now. That for the first 5 years, oftentimes, the early stages of the disease, up until you start losing your balance, levodopa is very dramatically effective, but with some issues. The problem with levodopa is that within 3 to 5 years of using it in the form of Sinemet, for example, people develop motor fluctuations where the drug doesn't work as long. The duration of on time is less. People start having dyskinesias. There's a number, about 50% of patients will develop motor fluctuations within 3 to 5 years of levodopa therapy. And who is more likely to get these motor fluctuations? It makes it difficult to maintain a smooth motor activity all day long because the drug doesn't work all day long anymore. And what it does is an hour after, you might actually have excessive movements or cramping. And then that passes, then you're on. Then as it's wearing off, you might wear off. And so this is the issue. But why does that happen? Well, some of the wearing off is due to the fact that the degenerative process is continuing, that there's continuing to be a loss of dopamine neurons and the capacity to buffer dopamine that you've made from levodopa. The reason that in the early stages you just get by with 3 tablets a day and you can stop it for a week and not notice much difference is that you have remaining dopamine neurons. You have depletion, but you still have surviving dopamine neurons that can store dopamine from the levodopa you give at 3 doses a day. And even if you miss 1 or 2 doses, you have enough buffering capacity, storage capacity in the brains in the first part of this illness. But as the illness advances, you can't store it anymore. So that levodopa is stored elsewhere, other non-dopamine neurons, and it's released inappropriately. And what happens is you have to give it more often because the half-life, that means the amount of time that the levodopa stays in the blood is only 90 minutes. So if you have a level of 100, just say 100 units in the blood, in 90 minutes it's down to 50. In another 90 minutes it's down to 25. So the levodopa doesn't stay at the same level every time when you take it. It reaches a peak and goes down. And when you get below a certain dose level in the blood, you're off. And that amount of time that you're on gets smaller and smaller. The amount of off time gets bigger and bigger. So we've developed different things to try to improve the on time. One is adding a COMT inhibitor, that's entacapone. And what that will do is inhibit another enzyme that's involved in breaking down dopamine and levodopa, really, so that you get a little, maybe an hour more of on time. So that's what Stalevo is. It's levodopa, carbidopa, plus entacapone. But that's a brand, Stalevo, and it costs more because it's a new formulation. It's one of the tricks that pharmaceutical companies like to do. The drug is out of patent, levodopa, carbidopa is no longer patented. But if you add another enzyme inhibitor to it, go through the trials with FDA, it's a new drug, and its price is very expensive. But if you add COM10 or entacapone to the regular levodopa, it's another way to use it. Who is it that is more likely to get the dyskinesias? The complex motor fluctuations are those that have wearing off, sudden off dyskinesias, could be end of dose dyskinesias, all of the complications of levodopa therapy. The younger you are when it's diagnosed, the more likely you will develop these. So if you're younger onset, like a 30 or 40-year-old who develops the illness, they're more likely to develop motor fluctuations than someone who's 65 or more. Second thing is, so it's the amount of degeneration of the neurons and the dose. The higher the doses that you give and the higher the frequency of the doses, the more likely you are to develop dyskinesias. Now, given the fact that people that are less than 60 are more likely to develop dyskinesias, most neurologists rather not start with levodopa, because we know that if we use a synthetic dopamine, and remember I gave you the names of 4 of them, Mirapex, Requip, Rotigotine, Pro. If you start with those in people under 60 who need therapy to improve their movement, they're less likely to develop dyskinesias. But those drugs aren't quite as effective as levodopa carbidopa, and eventually the levodopa carbidopa can be added on to the dopamine agonist. But when do we really start levodopa or any of the dopamine replacement drugs? When should we start it? You have to tailor it to each person's needs. Some people are still working, and their job really requires a lot of manual dexterity, just signing things, computer, keyboard, or mouse, and it started on their right hand, they're having problems at work. Well, this person might be only just beginning the illness, but they are having problems with work. Well, in those cases, I would give a drug to alleviate the symptoms earlier than I would if someone was retired and didn't need to have perfect dexterity. So those are like little considerations. If the person's less than 60, I'll use a dopamine agonist. Now, the dopamine agonist has the advantages that it's not affected by what you eat. Whereas levodopa, since it's a NAT found in all proteins, is affected by other amino acids circulating in the blood that also want to get into the brain, that need to get into the brain. So the dopamine agonists have that advantage, and the beauty of the dopamine agonists, they have really good sustained release forms. Now, dopamine in the deep gray structures of the brain should be working tonically. And the only way to do that is to have constantly maintained levels of dopamine. The way the brain does it, it always has very nice levels of dopamine stored in the dopamine terminals, and it's released in the communication, in the network, in the motor network. The agonists, synthetic agonists, can also achieve steady states. And so anyone who's wearing off and has motor fluctuations does well with a dopamine agonist added on to constantly stimulate dopamine receptor. And oftentimes you can decrease the amount of levodopa that you need. The best one for that, I think, is rotigotine or the new Pro patch, if you can take that. Unfortunately, it's a very expensive, being new, and a lot of drug insurance companies don't like to cover it. We have to demonstrate that you failed every other agonist first. And then some of the agonists, like Requip extended release or Mirapex extended release, also last longer, but you have to take it 2 or 3 times a day, whereas the patch is just once a day. What's the downside of a dopamine agonist? Number one, it's not quite as effective. Number two, it can lead to impulse control problems, like gambling, obsession about sexual things, that kind of thing. So people can all of a sudden become avid gamblers when they get on Mirapex. Sometimes they're more likely to cause, in older or demented subjects, hallucinations and psychosis. The agonists are more likely than levodopa carbidopa. So that's the dopamine system. It's the cornerstone of treatment of this illness because maintaining dopamine levels constant will allow for normal speed of movement and normal motor tone. Sometimes the tremor doesn't disappear. So it'll take me to another class. In many patients, a tremor may not even be present. In Parkinson's disease, 30% of patients never have tremor, right? And in Parkinson's disease with tremor, sometimes the dopamine replacement doesn't completely control the tremor. Patients no longer have slowness or rigidity. They can get up from a chair, have good facial expression, but they still have the little rest tremor. So for rest tremor, there's the oldest class of drugs to be used in Parkinson's disease. Were really good for rest tremor. And we go back to the 19th century when we didn't know much about Parkinson's disease. But in 1860, when it was considered to be a neurosis, Charcot and other French neurologists began to use extracts of belladonna to treat this illness. And extracts of belladonna contain anticholinergic drugs. And they interact with cholinergic receptors in the deep gray structures of the brain. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of neuropharmacology. When dopamine levels are real low in the striatum, like in Parkinson's disease, the acetylcholine, which is another neurotransmitter, is high. If you inhibit acetylcholine action by using anticholinergic drugs, you can alleviate tremor and a little bit of slowness and rigidity. Now, this was observed empirically that extracts of belladonna, if given in very small doses, would improve tremor, slowness, and rigidity. And that was really one of the treatments that was used until, in fact, it's still used, but now we don't use extracts of the plant because they're hard. They can cause hallucinations and confusion, short-term memory problems, constipation, and urinary bladder inhibition. That's what anticholinergics will do. Worst of all is the short-term memory problems, but then constipation and urinary retention are not good either. So it has to be used in very low doses. And anyone over 60 would never use these kind of drugs because they already have incipient problems with memory. Not everyone, but still you can ask for a memory disorder if you start using that drug. But now we use drugs that are like belladonna alkaloids, very similar, the same class of drug, but pure drugs, and that's called artane or cogentin. Artane generically is known as trihexyphenidyl, and the other one, cogentin, is biparidine. So these are anticholinergic drugs that we have to use with great caution where tremor predominant Parkinsonism is the issue. And if anyone's over 60, I'd rather not use that drug. If someone's less than 60 and has tremor predominant Parkinson's disease, artane or cogentin are very useful, but never more than 6 milligrams total per day. So now I've talked about 2 classes of drugs, the dopamine replacement drugs and the anticholinergic drugs. The anticholinergic drugs aren't used very often in the average patient with Parkinson's disease. If someone comes to me and they're on anticholinergic drugs and levodopa and dopamine agonists, and I see that they're confused and have really hard time with their cognitive function, well, first thing that goes is artane, and often improves things dramatically. So the other class, I should tell you a bit more about some exotic drugs. Exotic drugs that led to the monoamine oxidase inhibitors like Depronel and Rasagiline, which is rasagiline is like selegiline, and it's Azilect is the brand name, right? How did those two classes of drugs, selegiline and rasagiline, come to be used in Parkinson's disease? They're known as monoamine oxidase inhibitors. It's another enzyme that breaks down dopamine. The Mao-B, monoamine oxidase inhibitor that's found in the brain, breaks down dopamine. And if you inhibit monoamine oxidase B with one of these two drugs, you have a little bit more dopamine. And you have less oxidative stress. So the reason these drugs were developed was, ideally, it was to slow progression of the disease by inhibiting oxidative stress, which seems to drive the degenerative process forward. Well, big studies were done, and it didn't really have any impact on progression. In the Azilect study, it's questionable whether it delayed the need for levodopa, but whether it actually slows progression, it's up in the air. Many people will use it as soon as the diagnosis is made, but levodopa treatment is not necessary. In anyone less than 60, they'll be either on selegiline or Azilect as hopefully to delay the progression of the disease by virtue of its antioxidative properties or some other effects that we don't quite understand. There's still, those Mao-B inhibitors are quite intriguing. I rarely prescribe the Azilect because it's very expensive. I tend to, if I'm going to use that class of drug, I'll use selegiline, which is now a generic drug. What's the exotic part of this class of drugs, which are called Mao-B inhibitors? I'd like to refresh your minds again. First class of drugs we spoke about are dopamine replacement, which are key for slowness and rigidity improvement. Second class of drug is anticholinergic. It's good for tremor, but I'm very cautious about it. And then this next class are called Mao-B inhibitors. Now, if you add that on to someone who is fluctuating and wearing off, sometimes there's less fluctuations with Azilect. So it might, by slowing down the metabolism of dopamine itself, the Mao-B inhibitor might improve motor control. But the exotic origins of these drugs, I just find this fascinating because I'm a history buff, ethnobotany and the history of neuropharmacology. So in the 1920s, there was a neurologist, he's actually a pharmacologist, neuropharmacologist, they call him a toxicologist, named Louis Levin, Lewin, who was really the father of modern psychopharmacology. He had done a lot of work. He isolated the hallucinogenic compound mescaline from the cactus. He identified curare, which is the paralyzing poison and arrowhead poisons in the Amazon. And one of his last works is to isolate the active agent from a vine used in a hallucinogenic beverage by most Amazonian tribes as part of their rituals and healing practices. And the beverage is known as ayahuasca. So it now has a resurgence of interest by scientists and so forth. But ayahuasca is used by shamans in a number of situations. And it was described by the early British and Spanish and explorers how it was being used in Brazil, in anywhere where there was Amazonian tribes, in Colombia. And what they found, it was made up of two plants. One was a vine called Banisteriopsis. It's a very common woody vine that grows in the jungles of the Amazon. And the other was a leafy bush called Psychotria. They would boil those two. They'd crush the bark of that vine and put it in with the leaves and stir for 24 hours and get a concentrate. Filter it out, and they'd have this dark brown, oily material that they'd drink. And the first response is vomiting and cleansing, both ends, vomiting and diarrhea. You clear up, and then the hallucinations start. So people have out-of-body experiences. The shamans use that to remove the evil spirits. So this was observed and written by anthropologists. It's fascinating. But Louis Levin was curious about what was the active principle. So he began a lot of experiments. He was able to identify from the vine a material that he called banisterine. And in purifying it, he did bioassays, as the psychopharmacologist did, that he would take an extract, inject it under the skin, and see what effects it had. And he found that this extract of banisterine improved his motor function, completely cut his appetite. He could stay up all night, and was felt very strong. And he said this has a psychostimulant effect. But because I feel so light on my feet and I move so smoothly, almost like floating, maybe this would be good for Parkinson's disease where they have nothing except for the belladonna alkaloids. And one other that I forgot to mention, which is also becoming of interest. Anyway, so he ended up suggesting a clinical trial in Germany, because he was in Germany. In 1930, there was a clinical study that was published that created tremendous press. Magic drug from Amazon cures Parkinson's disease. This is what the media does. Hyperbole, right? And then other people repeated the experiments. They found that the extract, the banisterine given to Parkinson patients improved slowness, rigidity. These are people in a wheelchair bound to get up and walk. And it would work for about 6 hours and we're off. But it tended to not improve the tremor. And actually they developed an action tremor as a side effect. I'm not going to get into all. I wrote an article about this in around 1980. I found the original papers by Louis Lewin, had it translated. I said, we should really re-explore these drugs. But the reason I wrote the article was, as I followed up what happened to this magic drug, was that the English tried to replicate it. Now remember, the English and the Germans turned up, well, the English referred to Germans as Hans. Things were never very good between them, and then the war, then the Depression, and then the war. So the English tried to replicate these experiments the Germans had done, and couldn't. The English used harmine, which is identical to the banisterine according to their chemist, and that was the controversy. He said, it doesn't work. It's just the power of suggestion. The Germans, they had the power of suggestion. That's why they reported all those benefits. So that experiment died, and nothing ever happened of it. Louis Lewin died in 1931, and all of that was forgotten history until I found a reference to it. And then I don't read German, I had all the papers translated. I wrote a review on banisterine and Parkinson's disease. The reason is that it turned out that monoamine oxidase, the enzyme that breaks down dopamine, was first described around 1920, but no one knew what to make of it. It was found as an enzyme in liver, monoamine oxidase. And it was around 1960 when they began to give levodopa that one of the neurologists thought of adding an MAO inhibitor to the levodopa, with the idea is that it would prevent the breakdown, and so you would have you could get by with less levodopa. But I'm going to make the story can get pretty complicated if I get into too much detail. But so it turned out that this banisterine was the first MAO inhibitor that was used to treat Parkinson's disease. And so I gave a talk on this topic when I was in Brazil. I was invited to speak about banisterine and Parkinson's disease, and it's a funny story of how they would ask me to do that. But there were a few neurologists who said, well, I know some of my patients in Brazil that they make a tea out of the vine, and it helps their Parkinsonism. And he said, could we do a study? I said, well, to do a study like that in the US is impossible. Now, he was an Ecuadorian neurologist who attended this international meeting, so we designed a study that was done in Ecuador where we prepared the extract, gave it to Parkinson patient, and it was fantastic. So we ended up publishing the paper and got attention. And now, recently, there's a group in England who wants to repeat the study on a larger level, because we don't think it's the Mao-B inhibition effect. There's something else about that drug. So I'm telling you the story because sometimes this is how new drugs are discovered. You always start with the plant, follow it through, and then it drops out. Why did it drop out? Why was there a loss of interest? So there's a new interest in this hallucinogenic pine. Similarly, what other drug was used in the 19th century? Extracts of opium and cannabis tincture, right? 19th century, so these belladonna alkaloids. We didn't know anything about dopamine, but we knew about extracts, acid extracts of opium contain apomorphine. Now apomorphine is now currently used, it's a dopamine agonist. It's actually the first dopamine agonist that was ever used in Parkinson's disease, but when it was being used in England in the 19th century, they didn't know it was a dopamine agonist. They just said it's an extract of opium. And the extracts of opium were being used to treat Parkinson's disease. It's only later, and opium has about 20 different alkaloids, one of them being apomorphine, and apomorphine acts on dopamine receptors. And it very, very quickly gets into the brain. So they now have apocrine, which is apomorphine injections that are used for sudden immobility. It acts so quickly that it can break the freeze. So that's a 19th century drug. It's an opiate-derived drug that is now available as a pure drug in an injectable form. Again, but that's a dopamine kind of a drug. How about the other one that's quite interesting, the cannabis? Now, cannabis is a complex plant. They used tincture of cannabis, alcoholic extracts of cannabis, and how that came about was because a Dr. O'Shaughnessy was a British physician with the troops of the British troops in India, and saw how they were using cannabis preparations for tremor and nervous conditions. So he brought a whole bunch of his O'Shaughnessy's elixir to England and began to prescribe it for Parkinsonism or paralysis agitans, and that was the standard of therapy. Tincture, they would put so many drops of the tincture of cannabis into their tea, very proper British way of administering a drug, and that was very helpful for Parkinson's disease. It was in the classic book on neurology by Gowers, who it's kind of like the handbook of neurology of the 19th century. In fact, cannabis was prescribable for a whole number of conditions, including Parkinson's disease. Until 1937, it was in all the pharmacopoeia listed as an official drug. But because of the Marijuana Tax Act and the repeal of prohibition and the attack on cannabis used by Mexicans and reefer madness and the redeployment of the Anslinger's anti-prohibition, the alcohol, they were you saw Elliot Ness going after the gangsters. Well, those people went after now the cocaine and marijuana users because they couldn't go after the bootleggers when alcohol prohibition was repealed. And so it became really impossible to use cannabis as a medicine. It remained kind of the drug of abuse, a gateway drug. It was destroying our youth, destroying our middle class. It was the most dangerous drug out there. And there are people in the government that still say that, although NIH has a patent on a component of cannabis as a neuroprotective agent. And there's a number of studies that suggest that cannabis in the right formulation could be useful for Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders, as well as pain conditions, motor muscle spasms, peripheral neuropathies, etc. So here we have it. What I think is that eventually there are going to be new classes of drugs for Parkinson's disease that will target the one area that we need help in, which is gait and balance. That's the one thing that none of the drugs I talked to you about have improved gait and balance at the time when you really need it. Now, in the early stages of the illness, when you just have slowness and rigidity, you might have a small stride and decrease arm swing. Levodopa will improve that, right? We all know that. But when you start all of a sudden to propulse or to fall, levodopa doesn't help that. Or dopamine agonists, or anticholinergics, or hallucinogenic, and nothing. So there's a tremendous need for an approach that will treat gait and balance problems. Right now, we rely on alternative therapies for that. Physical therapy, gait and balance training, dance training. There's a lot of research as to why sudden immobility occurs. And it's an issue of sensory motor integration problems. You can overcome the freezing if you have additional sensory input. Visual cue or rhythmic cue, auditory cue, then you can continue that stride. Think of one more. So the neuroprotective therapies, there's some hope for that too. For me, I think the best neuroprotective and perhaps curative approach would be kind of immune-based. Immune-based means a vaccination. So develop a vaccine against alpha-synuclein, which is in Lewy bodies. And that would allow the Lewy bodies to be cleared and therefore reverse the disease or prevent it. So that is going to be the cure of Lewy body Parkinson's disease. Now, the most important thing that I failed to mention is that all of these things I've talked about relate to Parkinson's disease, not to the atypical Parkinsonism. And so about 20% of the cases of Parkinson's syndrome may not respond to dopamine. or they respond only in the first year or two and then they lose response. So only idiopathic Parkinson's disease has a sustained response to dopamine replacement throughout life. It'll always alleviate the slowness and rigidity, but it won't help with the balance and gait problems, the constipation, the bladder issues, the cognitive decline, all of that. So the overall picture is that this illness, idiopathic Parkinson's disease, kind of is born, the brunt of it is borne by the dopamine system, but many other neurotransmitter systems and other neural networks of the brain become involved. The autonomic nervous system is key. That's very much involved. That's what controls your bowel movements, your bladder function, your blood pressure, feelings of hot and cold. So when that gets deranged in Parkinson's disease, well, dopamine doesn't help. In fact, it can make things worse. Like the drop in blood pressure and you stand up. Well, levodopa can worsen that. Dopamine agonists can worsen that. So those are issues that we have to struggle with. What I suspect that if we recognize, we develop this vaccine, it'll protect against autonomic nervous system problems as well. Because those Lewy bodies appear in the gut. They appear wherever those autonomic neurons are, those ganglia. Ganglia are collections of neurons outside the brain that are involved in automatic control of visceral function. And those autonomic ganglia often have, and in the gut especially, there are Lewy bodies. You can biopsy a bit of the rectum and see Lewy bodies. So the point I'm trying to make is that even the autonomic nervous system derangements might be treated with a really good vaccine, which would recognize the mutated alpha-synuclein or the Lewy bodies. I think I'm going to end it here and be glad to take a few questions.
The question I have is that what is the timing on taking the levodopa carbidopa? My physician suggested that I take it an hour after I eat and not to take it until 2 hours after I've eaten. It's very hard to schedule.
I'm amazed they can give you a precise time like that. What I say, if you really want to get the most out of levodopa, don't eat protein with that meal, and then take your medicine with the meal. What interferes with the transport of levodopa from blood to brain isn't all the food you've eaten. It's the amount of proteins that are circulating. So if you have a glass of milk with your meal, that's all you need to interfere with levodopa action for the next 2 to 3 hours. And if you take it an hour before that glass of milk, you're starting to get it into the brain, but it hasn't all gotten into the brain. Then you have your glass of milk, and then you'll shut off any other benefit. So even just that glass of milk, which is loaded with neutral amino acids. So what I say for breakfast and lunch, if you want to get the maximum effect of levodopa, is don't take protein with your meal. Now, if you're diabetic, you can't rely, you need to have as much protein as possible and as least amount of carbohydrates. So it's a little more difficult. Even better, you should use a dopamine agonist that is not impacted by what you eat, and then you don't have to worry so much about taking the levodopa. The other thing about levodopa, if you take a high enough dose, it'll compete with anything that's in your diet. So if you always have the same thing at breakfast, let's say every morning you have a glass of milk, oatmeal, and some cereal, and you have eggs and bacon, to just say. And when you take 1 tablet of cinnamon, you don't get benefit. It seems like it doesn't seem to work. But if you take 2.5, it does seem to work. But then if you change your diet at breakfast and you're out and you don't have that amount of protein, all of a sudden you over-medicate. So those are things you can experiment with. What I tell people is, if they notice that the effect of cinnamon is dampened by what they've eaten, they go to a restaurant, then they can't get up out of the chair because they ate a salmon and heavy protein meal. And not everyone has this phenomenon. It's usually when the illness is more advanced. In the very early stages of the illness, it doesn't matter. All you need is some levodopa to get into the brain. You don't need the full dose to get in because you have enough dopamine neurons to store dopamine. So what I tell people is, don't try to take it an hour or 2 hours after. Don't worry about that. take it at the times indicated. If it's every 4 hours, take it every 4 hours whether you eat or not. What's more important is that you be aware of whether or not a meal has an impact on the subsequent effect of levodopa. So if you see that's happening, then for that meal, in the future, you can eliminate protein for that meal. Or you can add an extra Cinemet under supervision to overcome the effects of that. That's what I tell people. And I also tell them, if it's just the first time you've taken levodopa, don't worry about what you're eating. Just take it, because that drug will last for 3 or 4 days. The effects of just 3 tablets in 1 day, once you've gotten on the steady state regimen. So that's my perspective on it. Okay, that's it.